Hey, all right, so as you should know, we have the special education people with us today. They have a lot of good information they're going to be giving us. We are going to have start with Jeff Wilcox, who is going to jump in and he'll introduce the other members of the sped ed team and get us started. So take it away, Jeff.
Mute. Sorry, guys. Everybody hear me okay now? Okay, did you see my slides? Can you see my slides? I want to make sure that's up and running properly here.
No.
Okay, let me share.
You couldn't tell at the state we use Teams a lot and Zoom very little, so bear with us.
Okay. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, welcome to the Charter Business Managers Meeting. My name is Jeff Wilcox. I've been under here with this team for under a year, and I'm fairly new, which means I'm still learning a lot, and I appreciate being here. I'm going to introduce, Cole Shakespeare is the manager over the fiscal part of our department. We have a special education part of that, where Neil Stevens is our manager. And then we have today Corey Erickson, Matthew Nye, Jacob Dick, and Jerry. I don't know if we'll be on with us, but that's our team. Here's our layout of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to be covering monitoring and the announcement process of the monitoring system. Corey's going to cover the internal controls. Time and effort will be covered by Jacob Dick, and the qualified staff will be Matthew Nye. Okay, now I'm just going to let you know that some of my slides, I kind of separated a little bit because the information, sometimes there can be too much information for me on a slide. So I might be clicking through these slides fairly quickly. If you do have questions, you can raise your hand here on Zoom. You can ask a question in chat, or know that towards the end we will be giving out our contact information that you can send questions or what have you. A reminder that the special education fiscal monitors, which we are here to help you in your application process, okay, and getting your funding, okay? Okay, so part of my monitoring visit outline for special education, I'll be covering very basically just the IDEA grants, the Utah grant guidance, which is also a short slide. And then I'll cover the monitoring process and then a little bit of the actual Utah grants system. Okay, so we're all aware of the IDEA funds and that there's two types. I've put a link here taking you to the website so you can see all the fun information dealing. Hold on one second here. My notes have disappeared. That's fun. Okay. Just know that you can go to this link. It will cover all the fun stuff that deals with, regulations, statutes, policies, processes, all the fun stuff behind receiving the funding that you're requesting. Okay. This is the special ed fiscal monitoring question. The uniform grant guidance is actually a link here that will take you to that portion where it explains why there's monitoring, why it's important, and that it's required. Okay. Okay. So in basic terms, this is the visiting process, the special education visiting process, fiscal monitoring. Okay, we have a notification that goes out stage. There's a time period for preparation for the visit. Then there's a monitoring stage, and then the actual review that we do towards the end. And the timeline may vary. So the beginning, you'll receive a notification letter. Understand that the business administrator or the special education director might get this letter. However, there's others that might be involved with the special education system at your location that may not be aware of this. So I'm going to cover this letter just quick. You can see that this might be redundant. However, just so you know, you're going to have it in different places that you can access this letter for reference. Okay. Contact information of where it's going. It does go to the superintendent as far as the letter states. However, it does go to the actual business administrator and or the special education director. In the body of the letter, you'll see that we cover the actual monitoring visit date and time period. We also cover the monitoring school years or the periods that we're going to be monitoring, that we need documentation within those periods. Next, we'll cover the actual documentation for just a moment here. Okay, so this is required documentation, and it's on this letter, so you can refer to it. And if you need to get with us anytime via email or what have you, we're available for that. But we do need a detailed ledger covering the function and object codes. And with this ledger, it's nice to have it in Excel if possible. Okay, we know that there's different systems out there, but we're willing to work with anybody in their different systems. Okay, time and effort documentation. I am going to refer to Jacob Dick. He's going to cover that more in depth. And let's jump to payroll ledger. Now, the payroll ledger is important, and if you can include, again, the function codes, the program codes, those things dealing with the employee and special education, it helps us line up what they're doing, how they're doing it, when they're getting paid, and does it fit the policies and procedures? That's also going to be important. But if it's in Excel, again, that's easier for us, but we'll work with whatever you can get us. The documentation for private school proportionate share and the CEIS, or the Coordinated Early Intervening Services. That's documentation that if you're using those systems or that part of your application, it does need to be show on the application, and there's also a couple different parts digitally that you'll fill out to cover it, but it also you'll have calculators that you need to make sure these are filled out and sent in and uploaded also. If you don't put one up or we miss certain documentation, we will refer the system and make sure that we get all the proper documentation from you, and we will ask for it eventually. So if you can just get all that up front, that helps everything move a lot faster and quicker for all of us. Okay. Copy of policies and procedures. You'll find that it's a requirement to have policies and procedures on time and effort, procurement, bonuses, and travel. And it needs to be in your policies and procedures and board approved by your board. We've been hearing a lot of situations where, well, we abide by USBE's policies and procedures. That's great. However, we need to see it in your policies and procedures, and that needs to be your approval by your board. Okay. Okay, the actual physical monitoring visit, again, the date and time will be set up for that visit. A meeting invite will be sent out via Microsoft Teams, and those that are required to be there will be invited. The actual day of the monitoring visit, we will get online or we'll be there personally. We like to go through introductions to make sure we know everybody and you know us. And then we'll walk through a series of questions. The questions are more based around policy, procedures, and processes. We want to understand how you're using the funds, and do you have a flow or a trail of the way the funds are being spent. So any extra supporting documentation that can help in this process is important, and we'd like to see that again up front if possible. Again, down the bottom here, just the current story. What's your current story for the special education funding? The hows, the whys, the whens, and whos in the trail flow. Okay. The actual end, we'll have a review. We'll go through that review with you. Any collaboration and discussion that we'll go through. We may need some extra questions answered or additional documentation, but again, the final review will go through an actual meeting, and then you will get a final review letter. Okay. I'm going to skip here. I'm now going to the USBE Utah State Board of Education website. The actual website has a section for grants. Okay, so up here I have a link, and if you were to click on, excuse me, go to the home page and you click on departments, then down to financial, and then click on Utah grants, and then I'm in the Utah grants section here. You'll see that there's an actual link to managing the site visit and desktop reviews. Okay, there's an actual form that will walk you through the different things of how to load things up into Utah grants and how to get into Utah grants and all that fun stuff. It's a really useful piece of information. Okay, this is actually the beginning of that actual PDF, and I have a link to it here also. Jumping into Utah grants, so those of you that haven't been in Utah grants yet, or those of you who already know how, this is where you go. I do have a link to it. Once you get into the Utah grants, you'll notice there's a monitoring tab. There's other tabs here, but the monitoring is going to help you with the visits. Okay. Going to the next screen, you'll find your actual visit. You can see special education fiscal monitoring. You'll find your name there, and then you can click on the all infamous, all seeing green eye to help you get into the right location. Okay. So I jumped in to this part of it, looking at my visits, on this particular special education visit, you can see there's a created and then a closed and a timeline or stages in between that will help you know where you're at. You're also going to see 3 tabs here: overview, attachments, and history. Let's take a look for just a moment at the attachments. In the attachments area, I could be corrected here, but I believe that the special education fiscal monitoring visit letter will be attached here from us as the grantors. This would be a place that you could refer to it. Also, this is where you would upload any and all documentation, and we really don't care about having too much documentation as long as it's going to cover the program codes, function codes, etc. That makes sense. So anything that could, and supporting documentation, itemizations of plane tickets, or if you're staying somewhere for travel, or the actual conference outline, anything that would help show why and how you're spending this money helps us. Okay. Okay, this is the end. I just want you to understand that we're all in the same boat together, helping the kids. And I believe that personally. That's why I love this job that I'm doing so far, is I do have a touch of helping the kids here. I am going to turn the time. I do have a page here of links for different things, but I am going to turn the time over to Corey Erickson, and he'll be covering the internal controls.
All right, let me just start sharing here. And Jeff, did you stop sharing?
Sorry. There we go.
Okay, that's showing up okay? All right. So just stepping back for a minute, the fact that we're talking about this today doesn't mean that each of you are on the list to be receiving a fiscal monitoring visit for special education. We're moving towards a 6-year cycle. So we're looking at, with the number of LEAs that we have out there right now, probably about 25 a year that we are targeting, that we're going through. But the federal requirements, has asked us to increase the frequency, and that is looking like it's going to be the 6-year turnaround for that. So you may want to keep, the video of this around, because it may be a while before we do visit with you. And we thought today that it still would be good to provide an understanding of the overall special education fiscal monitoring process. So Jeff has gone through more of the announcement, talking about the mechanics, getting in Utah grants, being able to look at that. And the Utah grants is used by many of the other programs, in addition to special education. So it's something that many of you are probably familiar with also. One of the purposes associated with our visits is understanding that internal workings and the processes you have. And that's where we come to talking about internal controls. And so on the internal controls, that was some links still with Jeff's there. And oh, I didn't start that far enough for the test.
Looks like it's going backwards, Corey. You're going further into Jeff's.
There we go. So talking about internal control. So federal regulation requires that those that receive IDA funds or any federal funds, that they establish and maintain effective internal controls over that federal award. So it's just not a matter of spending those dollars or using those dollars. There need to be controls in place to make sure that that USBE and Department of Education have confidence that it's being used appropriately. So we have the Code of Federal Regulations, and then also in the Special Education Rules Manual, we talked about documentation, that it needs to be able to demonstrate that funds were used for allowable compensation. So there's a requirement. And so Jake and Matt will be going into more detail on some of the different things that we look at during the interview monitoring visit process. This is more of what type of process and controls do you have to help manage that you're meeting the obligations. And so those internal controls, you need to establish and maintain effective controls over those federal awards and be able to provide reasonable assurance of that management of that award. And an additional principle is evaluate and monitor. And that's where we come in. The fiscal monitoring visits are required that we need to go out and meet with LEAs, meet with all those that receive federal funding, and get an understanding of the controls that you have in place. So there's kind of a two process. Jeff talked about getting the file sent in, and that's where we'll do a deep dive into, your general ledgers, purchases. We'll do some sampling off of those that you would load up in Utah Grants. But when we actually come out and visit, we found it's more effective instead of, trying to go through files while we're there, that we want to get a general understanding of your processes that you have in place. And that's where the internal controls come in, is just getting an understanding over the different programs. What are the steps? What are the process? What are the procedures that you're using to make sure that the funds are being used correctly? And the internal control, the framework, just briefly on this is a graphical description that it cuts across all the different functions within an organization. It goes across the different reporting groups and all aspects of that. And so, it's more than just, a process. It's, does your staff and are you organized in a way that's going to help provide some controls? Again, I think it's easy to work through, what you need to do is with all the responsibilities that you have as a business administrator, but then also to have the mindset for those that you work with, that there needs to be that responsibility, that there needs to be some control or oversight on how funds are being used. And you have processes that help support that. And so the kind of three areas that we look at for fiscal monitoring are allowable costs. So are they allowable for special education use, the time and effort, and then qualified personnel. And again, Jake will be going over in more detail the time and effort, and Matt will be talking about qualified personnel, the specifics on that. But as far as internal controls, the saying of say what you do and do what you say, so do your policies match what your practices are. as we've met with a number of LEAs, they will talk about, the different procedures of how their procurements are or their time and efforts are. But then when we look at their policies may not align to that. So you just want to be sure that, what you say that you're doing matches what your policies say that you should be doing. Because one of the internal controls that we look at is your procedures. And that's why we ask for some of the procedures to be uploaded, is to be able to take a look at those to see if those practices of what you say that you should be doing, that you're following there. So on allowable costs, Code of Federal Regulations talk about, excess costs, that you're just providing the excess cost of providing special education, that it should be covering your general ed expenses, but these are going to be incremental in addition to the general ed funding to be able to provide those services for special education students. That's where the IDEA funds are. They don't want it to be supplementing other programs, or the federal dollars to be supplementing what you're providing from your state and local funds. And that's where you get into your maintenance of effort calculation as a way to track to see that you're still maintaining state and local spending for special education in addition to the federal funds. Our administrative rules talk about establishing internal controls and procedures over the initiation, approval, and monitoring of expenditures. So, as you look at your processes, you feel like you have a good understanding of, the approval process of how funds are used. You can show, where those dollars went, and that, again, it's board approved, and that's your board, the LEA's board, that you'd need to be following there. So continuing on allowable costs, obviously the most sure way, to determine if costs are allowable is if it aligns with the IEP of students. So if it's fulfilling the IEP for particular students, what the costs associated with, that you would be in alignment there. And I briefly mentioned we're to supplement. This is to be supplemental use of IDEA funds and not to be supplanting or replacing what you would be using for your state and federal funds there. And the criteria, which you may have heard of before, is it has to be necessary and reasonable. And then you want that to be consistent with your policies and procedures. So you get to establish what those policies are and what the procedures are, and then to be following those. You want consistent treatment of indirect costs. So for one program, a particular cost can't be direct and then indirect in the other. It needs to be consistent across programs as what's dictated as indirect costs. Adequately documented. The federal government loves documentation, and we look at a lot of that documentation through the review process. And then obviously making sure that those expenses are occurring within the period that grant is established for. Talking about internal controls for time and effort, and again, Matt will get a little more into that, but it needs to be accurate, properly allocated, and it needs to be incorporated into your records there. So the time and effort, you need to have a procedure for that. It needs to be approved by the board, and then it needs to be as part of your official records there. And then qualified personnel, Matt will get more into that, but who is qualified, obviously, for those that are teaching students, if they're a teacher, they need to be, board approved and have the appropriate certification that qualify for teaching special education students. And then for those that are paraeducators, they need to be trained, supervised, and utilized in accordance with the USBE paraeducator standards. And so on that, what type of controls do you have in place that identifies what type of training, what type of supervision? It should be easily accessible, one that the paraeducators are aware of that, and that as we look to see what type of supervision or training those staff receive, that you're able to document that. So that's something that you'd want to look at your internal controls to say, yeah, I feel pretty comfortable about the support that I can show for that we could use, one for just your normal business, but then also for the monitoring visits when we come. Just on the additional documentation, so if you have questions, because as we go through in details on the general ledgers, we'll ask for different types of documentation. You can refer to the Special Education Rules Manual. So on page 345 in that rules manual that's on the USBE website, it will go into additional monitoring documentation. We don't request all of it. We just go through those that are applicable for your situation. But it gives you a broader idea of what type of documentation may be needed, and then to also check your internal processes that you have access to those in an easy manner. So internal controls, it's good for business. Recently there's been a number of stories regarding some of our LEAs that have had some issues that internal controls, if they were reviewed and more supervised or managed, they may have been able to avoid, being in the news or have the loss of income that associated with that. So for example, on P cards, having threshold amounts, certain authorization levels for different dollar amounts, kind of reviews, those type of internal controls can be helpful. There was another one where the outside auditor, if there was some additional segregation duty, they would be able to avoid a situation like this. So the internal controls are really to benefit you and to make processes go smoother as headcount changes. If there's procedures and controls in place, rather than just relying upon the knowledge of whoever was in there in the past, it's just good business to be able to have those strong internal controls. So references, and again, we can provide this slide deck that will have the links to the USBE rules manual, and then we have a training webinar that are available. This is the path on our USBE website to be able to access that regarding allowable expenses there. And was there any questions that came up? That didn't get
nothing in the chat, Corey.
Okay. All right. I'll go ahead and turn that over to Jake to go into more on the time and effort.
Yeah, just go ahead and press stop sharing when you can.
Try it now.
I can't. It says I can't. Well, I think you're still sharing.
Yeah, you're.
There we go.
There
you go.
There you go.
All right. Thank you, Corey. So as Corey had said, I'm going to be covering time and effort. I'll try to go, there's a lot to cover. I'll try to go fairly quick so we can hopefully get you guys out of here close to the top of the hour. So as Jeff said, I'm Jacob Dick, or I also go by Jake or Jacob, either is fine. I started with USBE special ed team as a fiscal monitor in August of 2023. I know many of you are also pretty new, so this might be the first time you've seen me. So good to meet you, even though I haven't seen your face. If you're at the other new BA training, this might seem familiar. If you're already an expert on time and effort, that's fantastic. But for those that are not, what we're going to be covering today is applicable time and effort USB board rules, or the ones that seem most applicable to what we're going to be talking about here. The time and effort federal regulation and explaining that a little bit, time and effort policy requirements. We'll briefly look at an example policy from an actual LEA here in Utah. Then I have a list of key takeaways that will hopefully be helpful, and links to the resources. So it's all going to be from a special ed perspective, of course, because we're the special ed fiscal monitors, but a lot of this should hopefully be universally applicable for you, since time and effort's a requirement for, I think, virtually all federal programs. Okay, but there is one more thing we're actually going to cover. And it's a quiz, so we'll see if people are still awake here, because I'll let you type answers in the chat. So the question is, are LEAs required to have a written and board-approved time and effort policy? I'll wait a minute and see if we get some answers. I'm seeing chat bubbles. Here we go.
It's pretty
Yes.
affirmative on the yes.
I especially like the all caps yes with an exclamation point. Put them on the good list. Yeah, so as many of you seem to know, yes. So USBE rule R277-113 requires LEAs to have a written board approved time and effort policy, and it must be publicly posted to your website. So if there's one thing you guys take away from this, it'd be good if it's that. Yeah, the time and effort policy, it's not really part of the auditor wish list or something we'd like to see to, strengthen your internal controls for your LEA, although it will do that. But it's a state board mandated requirement. So if you already have a written board approved policy publicly posted on your website, great, you're ahead of the curve. But if not, hopefully this training is a good place to learn how to get started on that. Okay, so here's some snippets from board rule 277-113. So you can see that top one there. Hold on a second. Yeah, so the top one says, so ensure that written fiscal policies and procedures address all applicable state and federal regulations. So there's your requirement, has to be written, board approved. So an LEA governing board shall have the following responsibilities: approve written fiscal policies and procedures required in this section. So written and board approved. And then -1135, LEA fiscal policies and procedures shall be available at each LEA main office, individual public schools, and publicly available on the website. And so you may have noticed in that first one, it says written fiscal policies and procedures address all applicable state and federal statutes and regulations. So next we're going to cover what that applicable federal regulation is in regards to time and effort policy. Okay, so it's 2 CFR section 200.303, specifically section I. So it's a 6-part federal regulation, which sounds and looks pretty intimidating on the screen there. And like all federal regulations, some of the language isn't really as simple or as concise as it probably could be, in my opinion. But if we break each part down, which I'll attempt to do here, it's fairly simple, hopefully. And 2 of them are actually more or less gimmes. In fact, so it's really 4 that you really need to remember. So the intention of this regulation, by the way, at least from the federal side, was to empower the LEAs to, accurately record time and effort in the methods best suited to your specific needs. Because you'll note that there's no specific required method in terms of like personnel activity report or timekeeping, whatever. That's really up to you. So if we go through them here, so number one, be supported by a system of internal control which provides reasonable assurance that the charges are accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. So as I just said on that note, there's no mandated method of fulfilling those requirements, right? So any procedure like a PAR, certification by employees and supervisor, a timekeeping system, etc., that meets that requirement is acceptable. Any system of, internal control that can provide reasonable assurance is adequate. So number two, be incorporated into the official records of the non-federal entity. That's my typing there of LEA. That's just the federal speak of saying LEA. So yeah, if you're posting your policy to the website as required by USB board rules anyways, then this one's done. So that one's a gimme, pretty easy. So 3, reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated by the non-federal entity or LEA, not exceeding 100% of compensated activities. So the way I interpret this is just record the employee's total activity. So exactly 100% of the time work, no more and no less. 4, encompass federally assisted and all other activities compensated by the LEA on an integrated basis, but may include the use of subsidiary records as defined in the written policy. So basically, if it's a federally assisted program, including special education, this means record how much of the employee's time was spent on special education, regardless of if they were paid with state funds like 1200 series or federal funds 7524, is the way I interpret that. 5 is another give me, so comply with the established accounting policies and practices of the LEA. So, comply with your own accounting policies, right? Simple. 6, support the distribution of the employee's salary or wages among specific activities or cost objectives if the employee works on more than one federal award, a federal award and non-federal award, an indirect cost activity and a direct cost activity, 2 or more indirect activities which are allocated using different allocation basis, or an unallowable activity in direct or indirect cost activity. So that's a bit of a word salad. My interpretation of this is basically if the employee works on more than one federal program, such as special education, and Title I, or there's many others, or works on federal and non-federal programs, like a split between special ed and general education, for example, clearly define how much of their time is spent on every activity they do and record every work activity they do, right? Which is something that you'd be doing anyways if you're following step 3 of recording the employee's total activity. So hopefully that breakdown makes it at least mildly less intimidating. Okay. Yeah, so we've established that a written time and effort policy was required. So, how do you create one? So to put it simply, like if you can read through those 6 requirements on the 2 CFR section 200-303 I, and as you go through each of the 6 one by one, you can say, yes, my written time and effort policy fulfills this. Then it's adequate no matter what exact format it takes. So neither the federal government nor USB requires any specific format in terms of time and effort, as long as it meets those requirements. But a couple rules of thumb here. So something we see occasionally is just, we open a time and effort policy of an LEA, just a couple sentences. So, a time and effort policy doesn't need to be complex or a bunch of pages just for the sake of it, but a couple sentences isn't going to cut it. I don't think I've seen one that's that short that fulfills those 6 requirements. So you can also utilize resources available to you. So any of us on the special ed team can offer guidance as needed. Our contact info will be at the end of this presentation. And another resource is other LEAs in the state with solid time and effort policies can offer insights. And we're going to take a brief look at one here. And so this is the first page of Park City School District's time and effort policy. So this was written with the guidance of Neil Stevens from our own special ed team here during I guess as a result of a monitoring visit. So yeah, so I guess briefly going through it. So they say any individual charged to a federal grant will keep time and effort reporting, whether or not as a semi-annual certification, personal activity report, or PUR. Semi-annual certification will be completed by those individuals who have a single cost objective like special ed. Semi-annual personnel activity reports will be completed by individuals who have multiple cost objectives. Under IDEA, any individual who is not 100% special education will complete semi-annual PAR. And then they list the requirements for that. So note that with this policy, it's specific and states exactly what the LEA is going to do for time and effort and how they're going to do it. And that's really what makes it effective, right? So with some LEAs, we just see a copy paste of that federal regulation they showed you, that big 6-part monster. And that's really not a time and effort policy. So for one, it doesn't meet those 6 minimum federal requirements for a policy. And just as importantly, you know, it's not effective. So when there's turnover or new employees brought on board, which I know can be frequent sometimes, nobody can look at that time and effort policy that's just a couple of sentences or a copy and paste of the federal regulation and have any idea how your LEA actually does and records time and effort, and nor will they be able to read that and understand their responsibilities regarding time and effort. You know, and training and coaching on time and effort is obviously, you know, good, but training and coaching combined with an effective written policy that any employee can reference at any time is great, in my opinion. Yeah, and don't worry about taking notes. So a link to the whole policy be provided. This is just the first page. Yeah, and this is skipping down to the final page of Park City School District's time and effort policy, which shows an example of the actual semi-annual certifications that some employees would complete. So again, you can note like it's nothing fancy or overly complex for the sake of complexity. The point is that it's accurate to what the LEA actually does and it fulfills the federal requirements, right? So a certification like this isn't required. To be clear, there can be a timekeeping system or anything else that fulfills those 6 requirements. So please don't take this presentation as USBE telling you that you must do a certification-based time and effort system, although it's, of course, an option. The purpose that I'm making here, or the point I'm making here, is that there should be a logical method of tracking and internal control like this, and that the time and effort policy should describe the actual procedures that the LEA follows to record time and effort. Right, so my final slide here is some key takeaways and do's and don'ts for time and effort policy that will hopefully be helpful reference in the future. So I would say do think of the time and effort policy as a manual. So anyone who reads the policy should be able to understand exactly how your LEA does time and effort, describe it step by step, like we saw with that example before. So this won't only satisfy, you know, the auditors or fiscal monitors like us, but more importantly, it'll help guide new staff on how things should be done in the event that there's turnover. 2, do take the time to align your written policy with real world procedures. This is something that Corey touched on in his presentation too. So again, that it's not time and effort policy isn't just a check the box item that auditors want to see you have. We specifically want to see that the policy matches up with how time and effort is actually being done at your specific LEA, and doing it that way makes the policy much more useful to you and your employees too. And I would say do utilize references like the one we provided with Park City, with a caveat. There's already plenty of LEAs with adequate publicly available time and effort policies like the Park City one provided. And you should use that to your advantage if it's helpful when you're developing, revising a policy. Just remember that copy and pasting other policies probably not going to cut it, because it needs to be tailored to your LEA and what you actually do. So be aware of that. I'd say read the 6 requirements of that federal regulation and ensure your policy meets the minimum standards. So think of the federal regulation as a guide, in my opinion, not something to be, afraid of. If you can mark yes to each of those requirements when you're finished writing or revising your policy, if you need to do that, then I can pretty much guarantee you're going to be good to go on time and effort policy. And then for a final due, I'd say reach out to USB staff, us, if you need help. It's part of our job. So we're fiscal monitors, but we don't just do monitoring, auditing, technical assistance like this little class is also part of our job. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me or anyone else on the team if you're confused while creating your time and effort policy, or you need help with something. And again, we'll have that at the end, our contact info. All right, so a few don'ts to finish with. So don't have a procedure for time and effort, but no written policy. So like as we established before, having a written time and effort policy is required. So something we see relatively often is LEA has a set of procedures, but no written policy. And that's going to result in a finding when we do our monitoring as special education every time, and probably with other federal programs too, if I had to guess. So if you already have a functional procedure of how you're doing it, that's great. Write it down and make it an official board approved policy. 2, please don't reference OMB Circular A87 in your time and effort policy. Other than having like that regulation's been outdated for years. I don't know exactly how long, but a while now. So other than having no policy at all, this is one of the first things that will tip an auditor off to the fact that your time and effort policy is likely lacking. So I recommend reviewing the policy regularly to keep it relevant, useful, and up to date. Don't just copy and paste the regulation, as I said before, but just want to emphasize. So copy and pasting the 6 requirements of the regulation is not a time and effort policy. So we know the requirements, and hopefully you should too. What you should do is tell us and your employees how time and effort is actually being done. And again, to emphasize, don't write only a couple sentences. I've personally never seen a time and effort policy. It was only a couple of sentences which fulfilled all 6 federal requirements. I don't recommend trying to be the first LEA to do so. And for a final don't be afraid to reach out to us or anyone at USB or think it will result in punishment. So, reaching out to us and saying, hey, I don't have a time and effort policy and need some guidance on where to start, or I need to revise an existing one, may need some help. It's not going to result in any fine, fee, audit finding, or any other form of medieval torture. We can't write the policy for you, and we're not always available immediately, of course, but we're happy to help, because solving problems in advance makes both of our jobs easier. So yeah, that was my presentation on time and effort policy. Here's links to those board rules and that example policy that you guys will get at the end when you give me the slides. So thanks for your attention, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt now.
Okay. Are my slides showing up?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you, Jake. Again, my name is Matthew Nye. I've been with USBE for a little over a year now. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about qualified staff, which Corey did touch on just briefly. And so we actually kind of have a repeat of his slide. Qualified personnel are personnel who have met USBE approved or USBE recognized certification, licensing, registration, paraeducator qualification standards, or other comparable requirements that apply to the area in which the individuals are providing special education or related services. Your paraeducators, when used to carry out Part B of the IDEA, must be appropriately trained and supervised and utilized in accordance with the USBE paraeducator standards, which can be found on the USBE website at schools.utah.gov. You can do a search for USBE paraeducator standards, and it'll pull it up there. LEAs shall provide documentation of training and supervision to USBE staff upon request. and documentation of the services provided to individual students by those paraeducators may be reviewed. I think that's more of like our program team that's going to do that, but we are going to do review of those things as we look through the time, as we look through licensing and time and effort, as Jacob just discussed. So this is kind of what licensing structure looks like. An educator license is kind of like a tree. The trunk is the license level, the branches are the license areas, and the leaves are the endorsements. And when we come out to do your monitoring visits, these three areas are what we are going to look at for anybody that is designated as a teacher or like a psychologist or an occupational therapist, things like that. We are going to be checking to see if they have a license in that area, what their license area is, and then if they have specific endorsements for special education. So the first thing is the license levels. There's the professional license level where they have met all the requirements and competencies required. The associate is that they have a minimum number of requirements that have been met and or the competencies have been demonstrated. Special education license areas include preschool special education, school psychologist, special education, speech language pathologist, and speech language technician. So again, when we look at this, we look at, do they have a license? Do they have a license in the area of special education? And then the last thing we're going to look at is their endorsement for special education. And here's a list of several of endorsements that will be included in special education. The adapted physical education, blind and visual impairments, deaf, blind, mild, moderate, severe disabilities, special education eligibility evaluator, which I personally have never seen that one, but I do know that it's available. The special education mathematics and young children LSL. Again, not one that I've seen come up in my reviews of them, but it is a possibility. And what we are going to be looking at when we come out to this is each of these areas. So the license area, and the endorsements all have an issue date and an expiration date. And we are going to be reviewing that in your monitoring visit. We will look at when the license was issued, when it expired, when the license area was issued and when it expires, and when the endorsement was issued and when it expires as well. So just be aware that, working with your special education director, to be aware, these are the areas that we are going to look at when we come out. And this is what qualifies a person to be working in special education, paid in special education, are these things for your teachers. Your paraeducators, that's a little bit different, but they are going, if we ask for documentation of their training and their supervision, that's going to need to be readily available to be provided to us as well. I think that's really about the whole gist of licensing. It's kind of short, it's kind of sweet, but it is also kind of intense as we go through. And this is an area where we do see quite a few problems with general education teachers being posted as special education teachers, but without the proper endorsements. And if we do see that, we're going to ask for documentation. How are these individuals used in special education? What were they performing? Who were they supervised by? So there can be some definite follow-up questions based on what we see in your licensing and in your time and efforts. And I think that pretty much rounds out our training for today. It looks like you guys get to have about 3 minutes of your personal time back. So that's good on us, right? And then here at the end is the contact information for all of us who have presented today. As Jacob and others have said, please feel free to reach out to us. It's not going to be a punishment of any kind. We are here to help, here to answer any questions that we might be able to. Are there any questions for us at this time that we can quickly answer for you guys before we end the meeting today?
Not seeing anything in the chat, so it looks like we're good.
Okay. Well,
All
again,
right.
thank you guys for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate you. That was great information, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. All right, before I let you go, I just want to remind you that next month is the spring finance training. I believe it's on the 18th. I will send out a notice to you too, so that you have the exact date and time, but I'm pretty sure it's April 18th. And we hope to see you all then. Also for May, we really don't have a subject or a topic scheduled yet. If there's something, I have some ideas on what to do, but if you have something that you would like to have presented for May, just give me your ideas. You can email them to me directly, and we'll see what we can do to accommodate whatever ideas we have come in. But other than that, if I don't hear from you, I will figure out something that will be helpful to us all. And again, thanks guys from SPED. You are amazing and we appreciate you very much. All right, everybody, have a wonderful day.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.